now it's Carlos Castillo Pasi from King's College London and Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, and the title of the talk is KomaMRI.jl, Framework for MRI Simulation with GPU Acceleration. Go ahead, Carlos.
Thanks for the introduction. Okay, so for this talk, I will start speaking a little bit about Julia, because I'm not sure if everyone knows about this programming language, and I will focus on the similarities with MATLAB and Python. Then I will briefly talk about what's MRI simulation, and then I will start talking about Koma, show some applications, and finally I will motivate you to start looking into Julia, because a lot of packages in the MRI ecosystem are being ported to Julia. Okay, so introduction to Julia. Julia is not a very new programming language. It was developed by some researchers at MIT, and the only reason why people started hearing from Julia now is that in 2018 it was the first 1.0 release, but this programming language has I know, it started like 2010 if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, it's a kind of a recent programming language if you consider it from the 1.0 release. The idea of Julia, or why another language exists, is that they try to solve the two-language problem. That is, for example, prototyping something in MATLAB, and then when I want to do it in like fast, I write it in C++. So basically, I need to rewrite the code twice. Julia is already fast, and it has a very friendly syntax. So the idea is that you can just program the thing in Julia, and you don't need to do it twice. And here I just show some comparisons with MATLAB and Python. In MATLAB, you don't need to import packages, but people that use Python already know that you need a functionality from a package, you just import it, the same in Julia, and some similarities, for example, in the range. And I just want to point out something that is different from MATLAB. In MATLAB, if you have, for example, a function and a vector, this is broadcasted for all the components of the vector. Here in Julia, you need to explicitly broadcast with the point operator. So there are similarities and some differences in the syntax, but overall it's very similar. The performance of Julia has been shown to be on par with C++. Here I didn't pick one that compared it with C++, but you can see that, for example, for ODE solving, you can compare it like with state-of-the-art solvers, and the performance is very good. And also Julia, due to this, it has been in the rise. This is probably outdated now, but it's definitely something to start looking into if you haven't. Specifically for science, it's very important to have reproducible environments. Julia manages this very easily with this manifest and project.toml files. So this is obviously handy. One of the key functionalities or key difference of Julia is that the functions are not attached to objects. Methods that are attached to types. For example, this function here, the plus, can operate over integers or floats, etc. But if I define a my struct that is called my type, I can define the plus operation, extending the base of Julia to be something. And then, for example, if I just define the plus operation, and automatically I have the summation of my specific type, because sum is just calling the plus for the given type. So you can extend functions from other packages. So that's a very strong feature of Julia. We'll go quickly through this, but for example, if you have a function that is just x squared, and if you put numbers and you broadcast this, you will get the square for each one. But if you do the same with a string, you will, instead of calling the square method for integers, you will be calling the square method of strings. So that's why you have a number repeated here. So you are concatenating or repeating the string. And you also have emoji support, so you can do cool stuff like this. Okay, so now for the MRI simulation part, I don't need to go on what's MRI, but just a quick reminder that it's basically an imaging technique that can show you inside the body. For example, here I have a very good image of the heart. And how does it work? This part, I want to do like an analogy with a concert where you have a lot of instruments that are playing at the same time, and you have instructions for all of them. And MRI is kind of like that, but the instruments are not trumpets. There are gradients and electronic components that can control the magnetic fields, and you generate an image. So the MRI simulation problem is getting from this phantom that has a description of the magnetic properties and a sequence that has these instructions for all of the components of the magnetic field and how you change the magnetic field in time and space to generate the image. But you actually, by simulating, you're not getting the image. You're simulating the block equation that is an indirect measure of the object. So in the end, you can change the sequence to get different contrasts. The sequence here would be in blue, and depending on the parameters of the phantom in yellow, you get different information in the image. So this is the actual MRI simulation experiment. Instead of getting the image, you get something that is called raw data that is not very similar to an image, but as you know, this can be then reconstructed to get the image. So the simulation is the forward problem that goes from the quantitative maps or the image. You apply a nonlinear encoding operator, and that is the data. This is what KoMA is trying to simulate. And one of the motivations of developing this is that, okay, so you have a cool technique that shows you the very good image, and you look at the paper, and they used a different scanner from yours, and then the sequence is not very well described. So by doing it this way, you can obviously publish papers, but it's not as easy to reproduce some results, especially some parts of the sequences are locked or proprietary. So this is a timeline of not only MRI simulators, but a few other open source initiatives. I just want to highlight PoolSeq that kind of tries to solve this locked or proprietary sequence definition by using an open source sequence definition. And there has been a lot of MRI simulators. Probably one of the most notable ones is Jambris, that it was one of the first using CPU or multi-threading acceleration. Then MRI Lab, that it was one of the first doing GPU acceleration. There's TON, but KoMA is one of the last ones, and I will show what's the difference between KoMA and the other ones. So KoMA, since the beginning, had a few design goals. One, to be open source, of course. Another one that is very important is to be high performance. So the simulations are fast, easy to use. That this part specifically is something that we have put a lot of effort into. Extensible, meaning that someone can take KoMA and add like new simulation methods. They can swap stuff from KoMA and write their own parts. I will talk a little bit more about that later. Cross-platform, because especially for students, it's very important that they can install a simulator in their computer. And lastly, the use of general sequences that we are managing by using PoolSeq. So we are PoolSeq compatible. So you can write your PoolSeq sequence, try it in KoMA, and if everything looks good, you can then try it in the scanner. Another thing is that the importance of the eye or image part in MRI. Imagine if you take a photo and you look at it and it's something like this. That's why, since the beginning, we incorporated the reconstruction part using MRI Rico. That is another open source package in Julia that solves what it's called the inverse problem. So the forward problem is the simulation, and the inverse problem tries to reconstruct the image from the raw data. And basically what it's doing is simplifying this nonlinear encoding operator, making it linear, and then you can solve it with an optimization problem. And another feature that we believed was very important was to use open source standards. So one of them I already mentioned, that is poolseq for the sequence definition. But another one is for the raw data, we are using the MRD standard. So that's what makes KomaMRI compatible with MRI RICO. We haven't tested it with BART, but we're basically you can swap the reconstructor and you're not you don't need to use MRI RICO if you don't want to. And for the scanner and the phantom, well, we don't have any specific file type for those, but we're developing one for the phantom. So you have a description for a phantom, and you can basically share the phantom, the sequence, and then someone can recreate your simulations. And going back to the extendability, so you can extend functions that are from another packages, and this is done by changing the types. So what we've done is that all the functions in Koma internally are specialized for a simulation method type, meaning that you can define your own simulation method and bypass all of the simulation functions of Koma and write your own if you're not happy with them. And this is something we have put effort into. So to be as flexible as possible, if you are not happy with something, you can just swap it. And the sequence definition here is discretized from the poolseq. We do all the hard work, taking care about the discretization and how to do this efficiently. And lastly is that for the GPU acceleration, we take this phantom object, we separate the spins in different threads in the GPU or the CPU, and then you can add the signal into an array at the end. So for the extendability, here Pablo Villacorta, for example, implemented some phantoms that have motion described from the XCAT phantom. So you can have like from motion described from images. At start we implemented it using just functions. So here I can show you some examples with the Cine and a tagging that he did. So this kind of shows that people can extend Koma and add new functionality. Sorry if the video doesn't loop it. I hope you could see them. Well, another thing is that we compare our simulation speed with Jambris. That was one of the simulators that I mentioned. We're, of course, a lot faster because we are using GPU acceleration, but we also compared our results with MRI Lab, and at least we are in the same order of magnitude of speed, and the GPU acceleration were slightly better, but overall we are as fast as other simulators. But of course, it doesn't matter if you're fast, if your results are not accurate. That's why we also tested our results and compared them with Jambris that uses a completely different simulation method, solving ordinary differential equations. And as you can see, the images look basically identical. The results at the bottom show that the errors are very, very low, but we are multiple times faster. And another experience that I think it was very useful for us, sorry, here I'm blocking something, but it doesn't matter. The thing is that we tested this with students without any experience with Julia or MRI. And basically the instructions were to do some simulations with Jambris, MRI Lab. Here I'm showing just the MRI Lab results because some students couldn't install, sorry, I'm showing Jambris and Koma because some students couldn't install MRI Lab in Mac. And we used their feedback to improve the appearance of the user interface and just to basically corroborate that Koma is easy to use. We asked them how easy it was to replicate each of the steps for their first simulation. So here I'm just showing that you can select a sequence, then in the poolseq format, automatically gets plotted. You can press simulate to simulate with the default phantom, or you can load another one and then reconstruct with MRI Recall with a few clicks. Another thing that I think is kind of interesting is we are using Plotly for the plotting functions. So you can plot your sequence, and you can export this in SVG, or you can also export it to HTML, and you can have an interactive version of your sequence or any of the plots that Koma provides. So it's kind of neat and very useful. For example, if you have like a very complicated sequence, it's better to explore it like just clicking and dragging and zooming in. It's very different to interact with the sequence than just showing a diagram in a paper. And obviously, because we want to make stuff easier for people, we can also export to .mat the results. Now they are exported to the temp folder, but basically everything that is produced by Koma can be exported, and then you can play with it in MATLAB. Well, I'm glad some people already explained this, but we obviously are an open source project that we use code coverage to check which parts of the code are being covered by the tests, and we test Koma in Ubuntu, Linux, and Mac, and multiple versions of Julia, just to check that nothing has broken. This is called continuous integration, and we believe it's very important to make a code future-proof, or just check that nothing has broken. Very importantly, we have documentation. We are putting a lot of effort in improving the documentation, so you can check that from the GitHub. And basically, as this is a Julia package, it's just easy to install. Sometimes you really like a software, but you try to install it and it just doesn't work. In Julia, you can just add a package with add, and you do add KomaMRI, and that should just work. And if not, you should submit an issue because it should work. Just to go through a few applications. This is very simple, but it's just showing an FID with and without of resonance, and you can see the T2 decay and the resonance that produces these oscillations in the signal. You also can simulate 3D phantoms. Here is a brain, and the sequence is 2D and multi-slice. So you have 3 different slices. Here I'm showing the slice selective profiles, and here you see the simulations for each one. Another one that is kind of interesting is that you can simulate adiabatic RFs, and showing here how you can optimize on adiabatic RF balls and how the impact it has in the homogeneity of the image. And the MRI simulations are not just a toy to play or learn, they can also be used in research. Here we use Koma to optimize this MRF sequence at low field, and we generated the signal dictionary to do the matching and get very accurate results. And just to end my presentation, I want to motivate you to start looking into the Julia open source ecosystem. We have some meetings, and there's a lot of people porting packages to Julia. The Julia MRI ecosystem is growing. Here I'm just showing a few examples, but the next one will be your package here, so try to do one. And I want to acknowledge my colleagues in London and in Chile. And just to end, I want to motivate you to start Koma on GitHub to show support. And it's fine if you don't, but it's kind of my birthday, so I think you now need to do it. Thanks.